Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 167, and today's episode is a celebration of Screaming for Vengeance. The classic, and I guess you can say groundbreaking 8th studio album from the metal masters themselves, Judas Priest. Originally released through Columbia and CBS and even Epic on July 17th of 1982. And since yesterday, which was Sunday, this album has already reached its 40th anniversary. I was around when it basically hit its 30th anniversary, but here we are pretty much on its 40th anniversary. So 40 years to an album that pretty much laid down the law on what 80s heavy metal was all about. And it just influenced and inspired countless other bands to really kind of either change style or even go further with what Judas Priest laid down on Screaming for Vengeance. But since I'm gonna really go into at least the overall depths of Screaming for Vengeance and all of that fun stuff. Without further ado, let's definitely get into and just dive into the history and the overall importance that is Screaming for Vengeance. Let's go into it. All right, since this, of course, follows after 1981's Point of Entry, I guess that the tour was a very successful tour, and they did great for it, especially playing in the States for it and so on. It definitely wasn't going to be very long before they had to go back into the studio to kind of at least capitalize, but also kind of at least rectify a lot of some of the leanings that you kind of had heard on, especially the masses had heard on Point of Entry. So the initial recording sessions for Screaming for Vengeance all took place from January to May of 1982 at the Ibiza Sound Studios in Ibiza, Spain, BJ Studios in Orlando, Florida, United States, and of course even Bayshore Recording Studios in Coconut Grove, Florida. So there we go. And of course, the Ibiza Studios or Sound Studios in Ibiza, Spain, of which apparently during this period, it was commonplace for UK-based musicians to record in continental Europe for tax purposes. So there's a little fun fact there for you. But again, the mixing and overdubs were done at the BJ Recording Studios in Orlando, Florida, and of course also other extra sort of mixing and overdubs are done at the Bayshore Recordings Studios in Coconut Grove, Florida. So, and of course, still using Tom Allom for the album, and of course the same lineup is also still present. This is pretty much Screaming for Vengeance marked a first in their history as a band, because it marked the first time that at least a very consistent drummer made it on to at least a third record, which the first time, I think, at least before any, let's say prior to this album, the only other drummer that at least had been very consistent for 2 Judas Priest albums was Les Binks. Again, from Stained Class into Killing Machine / Hellbent for Leather, depending on which part of the States you were on, where that album was released. And so he at least made it on for 2 albums, but eventually ended up being replaced by trapeze drummer Dave Holland. So Dave Holland is the first in the history, and of course, in general, to be the most consistent drummer in Judas Priest's history. The second now also here being Scott Travis. So, but Dave Holland was a first. And he, of course, to kind of go along a little tangent, he did at least made it from British Steel up to about 1988's Ram It Down. So at of course the Ibiza sound studios in Ibiza, Spain, the band technically laid down 12 tracks, but it was only 11 songs that they laid down, because for what I've heard for years, especially what I've known about, was that the song "The Hellion" was meant to have been a full track instead of being some sort of segue intro for Electric Eye. But from what I've heard as far as stories and accounts, they didn't have enough time and money, to put down and for let's say, for more time in the studio. So there just wasn't enough time to really kind of fit in a full version of The Hellion. But there was some plans that they, at least from initial ideas for The Hellion, it was supposed to have been a full-on song. But again, a lot of time restraints in the studio because of, I guess there just wasn't enough money that they put in for it. I don't know. I mean, I thought they were making enough money to where they could spend quite a bit of time in the studio, but even some of the most popular, really biggest bands who had at least good backing behind the, from a label, I guess it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So they just didn't have enough time in the studio, but they did lay down, as far as I know, 11 songs for the album. And only 9 were chosen for Screaming for Vengeance. And I can run off at least the 2 songs that were left on the cutting room floor for at least a while, even one of them for even a long time. One of them is the most known one, that is Fight for Your Life. Again, it was originally written and recorded for this album, but it's a very raw, it's not a very proper kind of studio recording, because it doesn't sound a whole lot like what you expect on this one. I guess because, again, it's a very raw mix of a song, but it was used as a bonus track for the Killing Machine / Hellbent for Leather reissues from 2001. Again, it was recorded for the album, but it did not make the final cut. However, it was later reworked as Rock Hard Ride Free for Defenders of the Faith, which again would come 2 years after Screaming for Vengeance. Again, the follow-up to Screaming for Vengeance. So it eventually got worked into a track. However, the only song that pretty much stayed on the cutting room floor for a very long time was a song, and it was written and demoed during for this album, was called Earth, Wind, and Fire, which is funny enough. Who knows? That's probably why they left it on the cutting room floor, because it was just too much probably there. It's going to make everyone remind them of at least the band Earth, Wind, and Fire. Again, far from what the sounds of Judas Priest. But again, it was shelved for a very long time, but eventually it was reworked for the Angel of Retribution album as Judas Rising. So I would say Judas Rising was a better title for the song than something like Earth, Wind, and Fire, just because of it probably sounded great at the time for oh shoot, we need it would be a cool kind of metal kind of tone, because again, it's the elements, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of cool to kind of do a song that's around the elements of Earth, Wind, and Fire. But the thing is just that it just ends up being very tied to some real non-metal kind of bands. So I think that's probably why they left it on the cutting room floor. But still, I think it was a pretty cool track, and probably what would have been great on the record. But it just, obviously, I think they weren't thinking straight when coming up with a song title for such a pretty cool riff. So that's how long that song had been on the cutting room floor. But those are the only 2 that are known that were left on the cutting room floor and were not used. It just didn't make the final cut for Screaming for Vengeance, but 9 of the songs, and of course, including The Hellion, at least made it onto Screaming for Vengeance. However, I really should kind of bring up this fact that even though technically they pretty much had most of the songs, laid out for the album and were quite happy with the selection that they chose, but there was at least one song as a part of this selection that was considered a last-minute decision. That was the song You've Got Another Thing Coming. According to everyone else in the band, especially KK Downing, it was very much a last-minute decision. So, according to KK Downing himself, and this is all quotes from him, we were quite happy with the album, but decided late on that we could add one more song. I know we had some of the parts, but we set about completing Another Thing Coming during the mixing sessions at BJ Studios. It came together quite quickly, and I seem to remember that we all had a good feeling about it, as it did sound like a good driving song and possibly a good radio track. According to Rob Halford, who expressed surprise at the song's success, saying that track was buried. Normally, the tracks you think are going to do stuff at the front end of the release, but our friends at Sony said, we're going to go for this song. And we didn't really know what was going on. But then the feedback was coming over. Hey, the record's buzzing in this town and that town. And it just took off. So that was a last minute decision for the album. And eventually this pretty much ended up becoming the definitive track listing for Scoring for Vengeance. So I guess without further... And of course I should bring up the fucking cool-ass artwork that was chosen for the album that was done by Doug Johnson. It just ended up becoming a great full package for the album. And so on July 17th of 1982, Screamer for Vengeance saw the light of day, and everyone pretty much, well, to, I guess, reenact an advertisement that was published inside Circus Magazine. I scream, you scream, they're all screaming for vengeance. And for Judas Priest, revenge is sweet. The mega platinum metal meisters are now poised on the brink of a total assault on American sensibilities with their new album, Screaming for Vengeance. Forged on the altar of white-hot smoke guitars, jackboot rhythms, and laser blast vocals, Priest flay you alive on cuts like the Hellion / Electric Eye, Pain and Pleasure, and Devil's Child. And when they lay down the law to hundreds of thousands of disciples this summer on their gargantuan Coast to Coast tour with Iron Maiden, brother, it stays down. The animal flesh comes creeping back. Judas Priest, Screaming for Vengeance on Columbia Records and Tapes. And there you have it, folks. That pretty much ends up being the overall defining essence of that is Screamer for Vengeance. So here we go. Let's definitely read into all the track listing for at least the song. This album has pretty much been jam-packed with plenty of classics on here. Very much, compared to like freaking Point of Entry, even in some case, British Steel. Just from the opening instrumental, that is the Hellion, to, of course, Electric Eye, Riding on the Wind, Bloodstone, parentheses, Take These Chains, Pain and Pleasure, the title track, of course, the aforementioned You've Got Another Thing Coming, and Fever and Devil's Child. This album pretty much is head and shoulders above Point of Entry. And as a little kid who was really kind of very much getting into Judas Priest, I didn't get to hear Point of Entry until years after I'd actually had heard Screaming for Vengeance. This album really kind of furthermore expressed my enthusiasm into really diving more and more into Judas Priest's discography, because for years all I've heard was it was called Living After Midnight, the very best of Judas Priest. I've heard that compilation for years, and it had songs, some songs off of this one, again, like the aforementioned Hellion / Electric Eye, and of course the You've Got Another Thing Coming. These were the most known songs of the from this album that it made onto that compilation, and I just I like those songs a lot. And of course, me being such a video game player, in the early days, I was, since my brother and dad was heavily into like the Grand Theft Auto games, one of the most brand new games at the time was Grand Theft Auto Vice City, and where its soundtracks was all pretty much around 80s stuff. And one of the radio or just fake radio stations was V-Rock, and it used a lot of sort of classic 80s metal bands from that period. And that's how I discovered Iron Maiden. That's how I discovered Tessa. That's how I discovered Twisted Sister. That's actually how I discovered Anthrax and Slayer and so on. That's how I discovered them. And this is how I discovered Judas Priest. And it was just from there. And I just always kind of liked the track until one day my dad pulls out his record, his copy of the record. And that's how I first heard this for the first time. I mean, this is how I would say, Screaming for Vengeance and, of course, High Voltage from AC/DC are so blended into my memory and just are easy to kind of blend in because of those are the two records that he actually had pulled out. So I would be listening to these two records back to back, again, from Screaming for Vengeance to High Voltage of AC/DC. Of course, the more worldwide copy or version of High Voltage, the one that's basically pretty much takes the Australian TNT record, but combines at least two songs from the original Australian version of High Voltage onto the record. But again, that's just how I got turned on to even that record, and that's how it's just simultaneously these two records for me. But I just loved a lot of Screaming for Vengeance. To me, this, at least of all the Judas Priest albums I had heard at the time, this one was definitely up there as one of my personal favorites. And then a few years later, I then found, his cassette copies of like Defenders of the Faith. And of course, Turbo. And there was a point in time where as a kid, I actually really loved and appreciate Turbo as an album. Now, there's things I like off that album, but there's things I really don't really much care for off that record. But whereas I still have the same feelings for like Screaming for Vengeance and Defenders of the Faith. I still have the same meanings. The one thing that I think that is just head and shoulders above, Point of Entry and even British Steel, in my opinion, is that this one just really has a lot more interesting compositions in many ways. I mean, of course, it's got a lot of heavy hitters. I mean, I do love, Riding on the Wind. It's just a great rocker of a track. And again, just from again, when reading into or just reenacting that whole advertisement that was published inside Circus Magazine, it really best describes songs like Electric Eye and Riding on the Wind, and even to an extent too Bloodstone and the title track, and of course Devil's Child. These were definitely the songs that were just, that I would say reshaped what 80s metal really ended up really becoming. This really kind of, it pushed the boundaries of what 80s metal. I mean, I would sit here and tell you that I think Restless and Wild by Accept, I think did more for really kind of just completely reshaping what everyone thinks of, what 80s metal is, or just what heavy metal was in the 1980s, basically. And for what a lot of like the underground metal bands, that really kind of helped kind of furthermore push heavy metal into a little more of the forefront and kind of gave it its own identity. Because prior to that, everyone was mostly playing off of the styles of at least the earlier stuff. Mostly the new wave or British heavy metal movement and those kind of sounds. For example, as I like even ones that don't quite fit under the new wave or British heavy metal, but just had a very similar kind of feel, like Back in Black from AC/DC, or Ace of Spades from Motorhead, and Wheels of Steel, and even an extent Strong Arm of the Law from Saxon, and On Through the Night, and of course even High on Dry, both records from Def Leppard. Everyone was kind of playing off of that. It still had, you were still having your kind of still straight up 70s kind of hard rock kind of a feel to it, or proto metal. Everyone was still kind of playing around with that. But albums like Number the Beast, Restless and Wild, and even to an extent even Blackout, and of course especially Screaming for Vengeance, these were the albums that really began to shape metal into being its own identity, where it was starting to separate itself a bit more from what people were considering hard rock at the time. Of course, nowadays people probably will now consider an album like Swimmer for Vengeance, even if it's freaking heavy and very metallic sounding, those will still these days will now consider some of the leanings on this record being more hard rock. But at the time of 1982, this was still fairly heavy for 1982, and it was very much more and more metalized. Whatever was considered hard rock on this record had a more metalized structure and overall shape to these songs than what you were getting just prior to it. British Steel may have been pushing it a little bit further with songs like Rapid Fire, Metal God, Stealer, and so on, but it's with songs like, again, the Hellion / Electric Eye, Riding on the Wind, Bloodstone, the title track, and Devil's Child. These were kind of taking things a little bit further in a way. I mean, even though Devil's Child plays around with almost the 3 chords in a way, even though it's more than 3 chords, but just had a kind of almost AC/DC kind of just overall beat to it and pacing on it. It's just that it comes across as a lot more metalized, and it's got more of a completely different shape in a way to its overall style and performance. It just comes across as just more interesting for this period, and this is where everyone started to really kind of base a lot of their preferences off of this record. And I think this has really ended up shaping up a lot of other bands. Everyone wanted to kind of really continue on with this kind of sound. I mean, Iron Maiden were kind of taking things to that sort of direction, but these guys were pushing it as well. It's funny, I remember it was I think Rob Weir, I believe, of Tigers of Pantang, I believe it was him. He said at plenty of interviews he gave, was it like the one for like one of those Sam Dunn, I think was his name. He did like a lot of those little series on, each episode was kind of focused on particular genres. For an example, like the new wave or British heavy metal, and it was on that episode Rob Weir kind of talked about, and I believe it was him. I do believe it was him. And he was just talking about how the dynamic was that the whole new wave of British heavy metal movement was trying to kind of put out the dinosaurs in a way. We were trying to really kind of I guess at the time people looked at Judas Priest as a bit of has-beens in a way. They were being looked as an older generation, which is so ironic, because of whenever people who call themselves so-called experts of the new wave of British heavy metal, people would actually have made a lot of mistakes on throwing Judas Priest as being a part of the new wave of British heavy metal, which is not entirely true. And obviously, that's at least is very much pointed out from at least Rob Weir. And he pretty much was looking at these bands, like again, let's say Iron Maiden and even Def Leppard and Tigers of Pantang, his band, and Saxon, and some of these were kind of like the bands that were supposed to have really put out these guys and kind of make them, be the forefront of it. But the thing is that what they were doing was somehow making the bands, like giving them an inspiration to where they were starting to sell their most best-selling records. They were starting to get bigger. It was just, I guess, and it was all like the expense, and I think this album kind of ended up proving that statement, because what happened was that a lot of bands like Scorpions, who were much older, and of course Judas Priest here, they just somehow were getting bigger. The only band that was selling just as much as the same, I guess, number of records was Iron Maiden, who at least was from that movement, and they were still very young, whereas Judas Priest and bands like Scorpions and that, they were older, but they were all just selling as much as the same amount of records, but whereas Tigers of Pantang were not. So I think that there's a bit of an odd dynamic there, and I think there might be somebody not taking account that it's their fault why they probably couldn't have made that many records, or sold that many. But I think there's still a bit of truth to that statement. The new wave of British metal bands were kind of inspiring bands like Judas Priest to clearly push things even further, because they knew exactly what the audience at that period wanted. They didn't want, what they were getting from, at least at this period in time before. I mean, people weren't paying too much close attention to Kiss anymore until a year later, where people started to rediscover, Creatures of the Night. And Kiss, I would say, kind of belongs in the same sort of discussion of kind of reinventing themselves in 1982. But still, they had a very bad reputation of shooting themselves in the foot most of the time, because of people were I guess you say it would be a account of people just feeling like that they were growing too old, just growing out of a band like Kiss. That's like they liked them much earlier, but it seems like, I guess because of all the different, change in styles, them kind of trying to really chase after trends with stuff like, Dynasty with the disco, and of course Unmasked, and then of course trying to be more progressive or very Queen-like, I guess you can say, with Music from the Elder. It turned away a lot of its core audience. So bands like Judas Priest and Scorpions knew exactly what to do for their audience. They didn't want to try and fall into the same trap that a band like Kiss was falling, and fell into, or whatever, or even created in a way. They kind of created a bit of a trap there. And bands like Scorpions and Judas Priest didn't want to fall into that. So in order to kind of stay relevant, yes, they had to probably simplify their songs, but still retain a metallicness that at least is still accessible enough for its audience, in a way, the audience that were still into that sort of heavy stuff, that was still very metal. So they had to find a way that at least would still keep some of that audience. And I think they were creative enough to find a balance between simplified structures, but still be very metallic and very metalized, and still have those kind of compositions where it's still, you can still consider heavy metal. And that's what they found in terms of the formula here on Screamer for Vengeance, and it's all embodied in these songs. But there is still some attempts at still trying to be very radio. I mean, You've Got Another Thing Coming is one of those, but I think it's one of the best, songs where they, I would say the best experiment of being radio friendly, because it's still very rockin'. It still has a nice, upbeatness to the song, but it's still very driving. But you tell that there's a lot of sing-along choruses, but it works. This is the kind of song that eventually ended up becoming a call to arms for its audience, especially whenever they would play their shows. It would be the most performed song. It's one of those, and it would be closer to being one of the final songs on the set list. They end out the show. It just became almost a call to arms. And many of these songs, you can say, became like a call to arms for a lot of its core Judas Priest fans. But there's still other songs, like, for example, like the parentheses, Take These Chains. I say parentheses because that's what it is. It's not Take These Chains, it's parentheses, Take These Chains. Or parentheses, Take These and then Chains, whatever, that's like that. And of course, Fever. These are probably the closest you're ever going to get to straight up power ballads from Judas Priest. And I always find it very funny, like when they released or teasers. It was, I think, for one of the songs off of Firepower. Never the Heroes, to be exact. I saw how a lot of people were giving flack to Judas Priest for, like, oh geez, why there's a slower song here? It's more melodic. Why isn't that not a heavier number? People were giving flack for as another sort of teaser for Firepower, or like or even just like a appetizer for Firepower, before they really released it, people were kind of were a little bit underwhelmed by the fact that they released a slightly more melodic, slower song. And it's funny that people were reacted that way when it's like these same people somehow had no problem with these songs like Fever and take these chains. It's so funny that they had no problem with those songs, but they had a problem with Never the Heroes. It's funny. So it's like they somehow forget that Judas Priest has already played around with the more softer songs, even going as far back into the 70s period on like Rock and Roll and Sad Wings of Destiny, and then into like Sin After Sin, and even to an extent as well on freaking Killing Machine / Hellbent for Leather, with like Evening Star and Before the Dawn, or even on Stained Class. People also kind of forget that in a way Beyond the Realms of Death was a bit of a slight power ballad, even though it's not supposed, I don't think it was meant to be seen as one, but it just kind of had those same kind of qualities. But it was still a very dark kind of power ballad, and it still had a very powerfulness to that song. But people forget that they've always wrote more kind of ballady kind of stuff. So it's funny that how these same people who cite Screaming for Vengeance as one of their absolute favorite records were giving flack to the very same band for a song like Never the Heroes. It's fucking hilarious how they acted like that. But again, it just showed that they still tried to make it as accessible, but still enough to where they can grip in their still what they had of their core audience. I know you'll see comments in that, well, I basically left Judas Priest because of them kind of changing sound in the 80s and that. Bullshit. You still were buying the records to begin with. I think it's just that people love to hear themselves complain, because that's what we've got more these days, is people who love to complain more than actually, give praise to things that they like. I think, again, I just see a lot of people who just like to play bullshitter than actually be as honest. It's funny. And yes, I will take my chances on here and there poking as much fun at some of these same very people. People who go onto social media think that they can just say whatever the hell they want without probably thinking that people may not buy into their shit. So it's just, I think it's very ironic. Either way, there's some very, again, I dig these songs as well. I don't think there's really much a song in this record that I don't like, and I'm being honest with you. There really isn't. I actually do enjoy the more melodic song, this one, just as much as I enjoy the more heavier numbers as well. I think there's a really nice balance on here between that. And I think there's plenty of great songs, even if they may be a little bit on the power ballady side, almost bordering on being slight AOR-ish, but it works because there's at least a nice balance to these songs where it's not nearly as overpowering as it's like your typical Foreigner or Journey song during this period. This is like at least a lot more ballsier for that kind of style. It's at least it's a lot of good creativeness with some of these songs. They did. I think this is really much a great balance between a lot of these songs, where they found their way to really kind of be creative with these and really kind of make everything completely work in its own right. So I've always liked it. I think it just proves for me for even years that how powerful this record is to my ears, as it was once, when I first really heard it for, the very first time. So it's all great. But yeah, this is a great freaking record, though, from beginning to end, and I just like it. And of course, just I guess to bring up the statistics of the record sales, since I hadn't done it for a while, but I will bring it up just for little additions into this video. Again, as far as its record beating from 1982 to 1983 on the Australian album charts, which would be the Kent Music Report, it peaked at the position of 81 Yes, number 81. So it was at least, I would say that might be the lowest of all the, at least the chartings, here, the album charts, or whatever. I guess it peaked that high, at least, in Australia. But in Canada, which would be the Canada Top Albums / CDs, or PM, it peaked at number 17. But in Germany, for the German albums, I'm not going to try and pronounce its German title, but it is the Top 100. It peaked at number 23. On the Japanese albums, which would be Oricon, it peaked at the position of number 72. So a little bit above 81 for the Australian albums, the Kent Music Report. But in Norway, the Norwegian albums VG Lista, it peaked at number 26. But in the Swedish albums, which would be, I'm not going to pronounce its Swedish name, it peaked at the position of number 14. On the UK albums, which is OCC, it peaked at number 11. And on the US, it peaked at number 17. So it'll be the US Billboard 200. So it did fairly well for them. It did really good in the UK, and it did pretty good in the US and Canada. But it seemed to have done kind of poorly in Australia, I guess. From here, it did poor. But in Germany, it did fine. It did okay in Japan, and it did all right in Norway. And of course, it did, I guess, also good in Sweden. But it just did really good in the UK. It was a pretty good seller in the UK. Again, peaked at number 11. But again, I don't really care whether or not I don't base my judgment of a record just off of how great it sold in some of these countries, or even here in the U.S. It's about the music itself, just like what Steve Lips-Kudlow said at the Anvil concert. It's not about how great a record sells, as far as performance. It's not about that. It's about whether or not how great this record did on me. What's the music like? Did the music move me? It's all about the music, and I think Swim for Vengeance did a great job in really kind of cementing itself in the parentheals of heavy metal and the legacy of heavy metal and its audience and everything. It did a great job with that. And so for 40 years, this album is worthy of being celebrated. So there we go. All right. Of course, during this album and the year of 1982, they, of course, went on their World Vengeance Tour, which, again, began shortly after the album's release in July of 1982 and focused on North America during the summer and fall, Priest not performing in Europe until December of 1983. This emphasis on the U.S. audience was in order to establish a solid commercial foothold there. And in particular, because You've Got Another Thing Coming became a major hit, that and Electric Eye became live setlist staples and some of the band's most performed songs. Devil's Child has also been performed on various tours between 1982 and 2008, and Riding on the Wind, Bloodstone, and the title track have also been in the setlist in various tours. I seen Judas Priest when they played the title track, and it was an awesome experience for them finally playing that song. It was great. That was on the Redeemer of Souls tour in 2015. Though for comparison, Fever was only played at the first two 1982 shows, and of course, parentheses, Take These Chains only appeared in the set list in 2019, while Pain and Pleasure and the short instrumental The Hellion have never been performed live. The Hellion, though, was only used as, I guess, background intro, before going into Electric Eye. It was only like the song itself was used as kind of, to be played on the PA system before they really, go into the actual performance of Electric Eye. So in a way, it kind of did make it to the live shows, but not being played, entirely by the band. It was just used as part of their, to be played in the background of their PA system for the entire, audience to hear, and yada, yada, yada. But it would be this same tour where they would take Iron Maiden on with them. And since Iron Maiden had released Number of the Beast, This was a winning combination again for like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. However, besides Iron Maiden, Judas Priest were also supported by bands such as Crocus and Uriah Heep. So again, Crocus had One Vice at a Time, and Uriah Heep had Abominog at this time. So they had some pretty, still I guess, good selling records under these bands' belts. But Iron Maiden, I think, was the biggest name of them all, just because of what they had. Again, since Bruce Dickinson had just joined Iron Maiden, and they had, again, that whole record itself. It was a winning combination. So there we go. So Screaming for Vengeance, again, 40 years to a classic record, and I think it was, again, like I said, it was worth celebrating. And I think at this point it's still worth celebrating, and to keep the celebration going, I think it's great to kind of pass on this celebration tactic to all of you. So I think all of you are probably right now have felt inspired to pull out your copies of Screaming for Vengeance, maybe your old copies you've had since when it first came out in 1982. You may probably have your originals still with you, and you might pull that out just for old time's sake. So there we go. Just to continue on the celebration of this classic record that a lot of you seem to really hold very dear to your hearts. So it's great. So with that, I hope all of you enjoyed. And again, if you have any sort of thoughts about, since the first time you've heard it, or since the last time you heard it, whether it be positive or negative, you can leave them in the comment section below. So finally, now I can end out the video with, I hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.